Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with a new video, which is a Game Week 1 review. I'm actually in Madrid, as you can see, probably different to my usual background. And I did miss a few of the games on the weekend, but did get a chance to see some of the games I was interested in, such as the Arsenal game, even the Liverpool game versus Fulham. And a lot of things have changed, definitely from our expectations. I did think, for example, when we talk about something like Darwin Núñez and his impact, that was something that we saw already in the Community Shield match. And ultimately, there is a little bit of hindsight bias with players like Luis Diaz not getting hauls, but he was very close still to being a productive FPL asset on that afternoon. And those are kind of things we have to look forward and make sure that we don't knee-jerk over when we head into Game Week 2. One of the main reasons why I've headed into Game Week 2 with a little bit of ease of mind is because I have Haaland on my team. And I completely understand for a lot of managers who've opted to go for Kane at the start that there is a burning question now that you might want to go straight into Haaland for Game Week 2 for the captaincy versus Bournemouth. Bournemouth actually looked rather competent versus Aston Villa, but I think the worry once again is City being such a great squad. We expected West Ham to be a tough game for them to start the season. They managed to get a clean sheet and Haaland still looked to be a very productive asset, and you now have a great opportunity to captain him. I will also say that Salah still looks like a fine captaincy versus Crystal Palace, so that's one thing you have to think about when you're, let's say, moving into next week as a Haaland owner. Do you really want to move the captaincy and shift it from Salah to Haaland, or do you want to kind of play it safe and go with Salah? In my opinion, this is still a great opportunity to go for a Haaland captain. He looked like just the asset we expected him to be. As far as if you're a Kane owner and you're already behind and you feel like you need to chase, I do think Haaland is a great captaincy opportunity. From the outset, that's the reason why I've gone for Haaland as a pick. I didn't necessarily think he would outscore Kane this week. I actually expected to be much behind the Kane owners. It just so happened to bear out really nicely for me. So definitely people with hindsight bias are going to say the Haaland pick was very, very obvious, but I don't think that's clear. I think FPL Raptor summed it quite nicely in a tweet if you managed to catch his summary of that sort of Haaland versus Kane debacle and what the results have borne out to be versus what the logic was beforehand. As far as the rest of my team, I figured it'd be a good time to actually look at my assets piece for piece and see if I'm actually quite happy with it. Before even getting into that though, just tactically the structure that I have, the 4-4-2, it's still something that I'm very, very content with. I'm really happy that I am with Ruben Diaz, but I'll talk about him in a sec. This 4-4-2 definitely has this kind of Bailey-sized hole where at the 5.0 price, you have potentially some options that you can move into. I mean, someone like Dewsbury Hall did score for Leicester today, and it's interesting because it means we have pivots away, but at the same time I can completely see why going for a 5-3-2 template, even though it's inflexible, does seem a little bit tempting, because if you can move into a player like Perisic, or you can actually target some of the assets that you might have missed if you don't have triple Arsenal, for example, and you'd like to go into someone like Ben White, or maybe even William Saliba, who looks honestly like one of the best centre-backs in the league already, and he's been a player that I've been raving about for a long time now. I've been looking at Arsenal and their transfers ever since Arteta came in, and he obviously was a pre-Arteta transfer, if I remember correctly, or at least someone who didn't really have seemingly a good relationship with Arteta, but he has definitely established himself as truly something special when it comes to the centre-back position. And that's going to be grounds for us to say that Arsenal are probably going to have a much better season. So the projections around Ramsdale Arsenal defensive assets are going to be great. As I said, if you want to move into a 5-3-2 template, and you're even thinking about some of the other options, such as the Spurs fullback, which this team clearly lacks, if you see players like Emerson and Sessegnon had a very, very productive afternoon. Kane and Son less so, I think, compared to their expectations, but Kulusevski is still delivering extremely well. Those are the kind of things you want to think about when thinking about how your team is going to move within the next few weeks. I definitely think a 5-3-2 looks like a really strong template that does kind of preclude you from going for the forwards. I know a lot of people are going to be interested in going for 3 forwards because this weekend has really showed is that the forwards are probably the most interesting options, even when we're comparing some of the premium teams such as City and Liverpool, where you have Darwin, who could probably pair alongside Salah as your third Liverpool pick, and Trent as well, who's definitely a well-priced defender, or even just comparing to a team like Fulham, where Mitrovic really had an astounding display and really looked like one of the most interesting FPL assets for the rest of the season. Definitely if you're interested in Fulham, but not necessarily the most aggressive manager, something like a Game Week 8 wildcard does have a fantastic horizon for Fulham because they have really, really good fixtures after that point. And you could probably maybe even go for something like triple Fulham if someone like Harry Wilson is back fit and the Fulham team looks just as good as they did versus Liverpool. One thing I'll say is that Liverpool have always had 1 or 2 off-the-ball performances, or at least off our expectations, and I do think that was one of those afternoons. I don't think there's any reason to kind of knee-jerk over Liverpool. Yes, maybe it's a question of whether you want to reconsider what your third Liverpool asset is, but definitely not something where I'm thinking about I want to go off with Liverpool. They still look like a very offensively threatening team, and I don't really have any changes in my estimations of them. But let's actually head into, as I said, my team and my assets. Ramsdale, for me, as I said, super interesting because you now have Saliba in this team. Ben White looks like a very formidable right back. And what I like about Zinchenko joining the side is you now have a very competent back four that isn't injury prone whatsoever. Tomiyasu and Tierney were the exact opposite in the previous year, and despite building some synergies within the midpoint of the season, their injuries sort of precluded Arsenal's run towards the top four. Whereas this year, I think with the competency you have with Zinchenko and Ben White and their ability to play hopefully 34, 38 games in the season, and then Tierney coming off the bench or even other assets within the midfield positions being able to cover for players like Martinelli or even Jesus if they're tired, this really makes Arsenal a super competent side. And I think Saliba clearly proved himself in the Premier League. A lot of people watching Liga probably think that he didn't need to do that, but there is always that kind of test, right? You've had players coming from the Bundesliga who were very highly touted and not done well, where someone like Saliba, I would imagine, would not have been a household name previous to the Game Week 1 opener, but he clearly is on people's radars now. I wouldn't necessarily consider him as an FPL asset. He was actually quite close to scoring the Martinelli goal that he did from a heading position, and with his size and stature, I definitely think he is worth a shout. Definitely worth a shout over Gabriel, someone who probably offers the exact same that Saliba does, something like a goal threat. Maybe you'd argue that Gabriel is slightly better in the air, but I think that's up for debate, and the 0.5 million cost saving that you can get for going into Saliba will probably be worthwhile. Ramsdale is the asset that I have from the Arsenal defensive position, and I'm quite happy that I went for him because it did allow me to go for Ruben Dias. And as kind of mentioned on Twitter, Dias does allow me to move into someone like Perisic, so let's just move on to Dias as well. For me, City have one of the best opening runs of fixtures from a defensive point of view. Last season, we saw the exact same where they managed to get a lot of clean sheets, I think 5 or 6 in a row after they lost to Spurs in the opening game of the season. So I don't really think the narrative that a team like City takes quite a while to actually get up and going is true. I think going for double City defense was very logical from the start, and you just have to look at the fixtures and say, is it viable that City get 60 to 70% of clean sheets within these games? Or at least my estimation was that that was the truth. And that's why I went for Ruben Dias. And I just like Ramsdale at his price point as well because I think Arsenal will also be super interesting. I also didn't really want to go for a fullback, but it's worth mentioning Zinchenko here too at that sort of 5.0 price point. He did look like an astoundingly good FPL asset. Got into some more interesting positions than I saw him in the preseason. And that's partially because Crystal Palace do play with very, very flat wing backs. Yes, sometimes they are encouraged to overlap, but they're mostly predicating on their wingers to actually create plays and run off the diagonal balls that someone like Anderson produces, and you'll only see Klein really stand out in the wings to cross the ball, and he's not going to ever invert inside. He's never going to hold attacking positions. Zinchenko was really interesting. He always kind of stood in that pocket outside the edge of the box, and he did crack quite a good shot in the opening first half versus Crystal Palace, so that was quite interesting from just what kind of positions he can get into and score. But I still don't think he's going to be a consistent kind of lethal asset when it comes to producing goals and assists. Yes, it might make more sense in hindsight to actually go for a fullback, but I still think Gabriel and even Saliba will probably be worth a lot of money. Ben White as well, someone who plays at the right back position, could be crossing a little bit more than some of the centre backs when we're thinking about bonus points too. So I don't think there's any kind of Arsenal defensive piece that is far and above better than the rest. Some people might be thinking Zinchenko's that asset just because of how well he did in Game Week 1, but I do think all the assets are equally quite interesting, and Ramsdale is a little bit nicer in that you don't really have to force yourself to going for a defender, and he's a keeper, as I said, that simply presents himself as an upgrade over the 4.5 keepers. And Leicester defense, I think the less we talk about them, the better. As far as Trent and Cancelo, nothing really has changed in my mind about them. I think they're just going to be players that I'll keep for the rest of the season. If we move on to James, he is definitely still the asset that I think we thought him to be. He's someone who got bonus points in spite of getting a yellow card, and just showed once again how productive he is for this Chelsea team when they actually have possession and are able to control some of the weaker teams in the league. And as their fixture run presents, Chelsea will have the chance to do that, maybe with the exception to Tottenham. I don't really think they're going to keep a clean sheet there, but there's no reason to keep James or transfer James out for just 1 week because of the Tottenham game. You're keeping James and you're bringing him into your team because he has great dividends over this sort of Game Week 1 to Game Week 8 horizon, unless you're planning to go for an early wild card. So I don't really see him as someone that I even have to think about Yes, Chilwell did manage to draw a penalty, so that was interesting, but I do think there is a potential weakness in Chilwell where he could be rotated before Marcos Alonso has his transfer to Barcelona. That's probably not necessarily going to happen, but you still have Emerson there in Chelsea as well to deputise at times, so I still think James is much better as a permanent option, and Azpilicueta playing at right centre-back hopefully allows James to stay there in the right wing-back position, so that's kind of how things stand for me. As far as Diaz, I really like him because, as I said, he presented me as an option to have the funds to move down into Perisic without necessarily feeling I was forced to make that move. If we use Trippier as a straw man, I definitely think that I would have been forced to the Perisic move without even thinking about whether Sessegnon, for example, would be able to keep his spot over Perisic for a while. Sessegnon had a very productive game. He was subbed off at around 63 minutes, so he managed to bag in a good performance where he got the goal in, and then Perisic came on for 30-40 minutes, probably with the opportunity and maybe with a view from Conte to having him ready and fit for the Chelsea game. But there's still an opportunity for, let's say, someone like Perisic to disappoint in the Chelsea game and maybe Sessegnon to start in the subsequent game. That's a very real possibility, and I do think going for Ruben Diaz just gave me a little bit more security in that I knew he would definitely play the games for Pep, and City have much better fixtures on that sort of horizon. If we move on to the midfield now, Luis Diaz I think is the asset that everyone wants to talk about. If they did opt to go for him as an 8.0 option, it probably precluded everyone from other 8.0 assets such as Saka or Kulusevski or even Maddison, who all found their way into getting a goal or an assist in their games. Mount was someone who also drew a blank, but I do think Luis Diaz is the one with the most question marks because he probably has the highest amount of ownership and he does hold that coveted Liverpool third spot. I think what was clear from the Community Shield, which was reinforced in the Fulham game, is that when Darwin Núñez comes on, Luis Diaz's role does dramatically change, in my opinion. Darwin's ability to hold the central lane and actually stay within that kind of position to make sure he is one of the key players just means that the Liverpool team almost revolves entirely around him at times. And I just think he's going to get the bulk of the expected goals and even the expected assist potential because he's in such lethal positions. So that definitely means we have to think about maybe an exit strategy to Luis Diaz. Potentially it's not Darwin Núñez immediately. Potentially it's moving towards a 4-3-3 structure if you aren't already embarking or didn't embark on that already in game week 1. But I definitely see myself rolling some transfers and having maybe another game week's worth of thoughts on whether Luis Diaz is a great option. I still think he's really good for the next game versus Crystal Palace. I'm hoping he returns well at Anfield. But once again, with Jota maybe coming back earlier than promised, we could have a situation where moving towards Darwin Núñez and moving to a 4-3-3 is the viable strategy here. What I think also throws a spanner into the works is Jesus having a little bit of a weak evening on paper does call into question whether he fits into our teams. But I think when you watch the performance of Arsenal, that was probably the toughest game within the early fixtures that they had. Yes, some teams like Bournemouth did look better than we expected, but I do really think that Jesus still looked like a fantastic FPL option. I think he could have gotten 2 assists on that night. He was very, very involved in many positions, and I just expect more from him in the future to come. So we'll have to kind of think about that and ponder about that a little bit more. Salah, I mean, nothing to say there. Mr. Consistent, Mr. Reliable. The captaincy is another kind of point of debate. I'll probably talk about him when I move on to Haaland. Bailey is someone who didn't impress, but his minutes did impress. And at 5.0, I can't really say anything more. Yes, Dewsbury Hall did score for Leicester. I really can't see myself moving into someone like Dewsbury Hall. I do like Bailey for the next few game weeks, and he's probably someone that I have to think about too. Whenever I make these moves, let's say if I was going towards a 4-3-3 template, I do have to think about how Bailey is going to be reflected within my team. Right now, he currently holds a starting position. But I also, if let's say we just quickly move towards my bench, I mean, I do have an asset in Andreas, right, who looked really good for Fulham, was in great attacking positions, as noted by most of FPL Twitter, and he can be someone that could occupy a great spot in this team in place of Bailey. Definitely could even start at times. This probably means I'll have to think about, when I'm moving to a 4-3-3 structure, whether I have money in the bank to move away from Bailey. What was nice about the Leeds vs Wolves game is it did present us opportunities through those hidden gems that I was discussing in the hidden gems video. Players like Aronson and Rodrigo looked really interesting, and I can clearly see myself moving and pivoting to them if I had a little bit more money to spare. Now, the question, of course, is when I'm moving to players like Darwin, if I am moving to Darwin in the future, which will probably be game weeks 3 and onwards, because I can see myself definitely rolling for this week, what the kind of solutions are. I do think you have options, as I said, moving to the 5.5 options. And Martinelli might even be a question mark sooner than later. What was nice about Martinelli, similarly, is at that sort of price point, you have options like Rodrigo now who do pose as really interesting options. The one detriment I would say to Rodrigo was he was subbed off at 64 minutes. So it was kind of something that I exactly mentioned in the Hidden Gems video. He is a rotatable piece, and the question of his fitness and how much of the press he's able to do for 90 minutes is going to be a question mark with Rodrigo. And right now we have Martinelli who's playing very, very consistent minutes, and I don't really see that being a problem in at least the short-term future. So that's kind of how my team is. It's a little bit, I think, stagnant in the midfield. I don't really see myself moving away from options like Bailey and Martinelli just because I have the security blanket of Andreas. I could even see myself playing Andreas over Bailey, but because Bailey had such great minutes, and I think the Everton game is definitely an easier fixture than Wolves, I can see myself still playing Bailey. 90 minutes was a great outing for him, and I think Gerrard sort of doubting over whether Watkins is the forward that he wants to play with was a bit of a plus actually for Bailey, who did start in an attacking position almost as a striker really within Aston Villa, paired alongside Ings on that evening, if you kind of take Coutinho to be someone who is playing more of the 10 role on that day. So I can see myself placing my transfer on Luis Diaz, but really to move towards a 4-3-3 in the meantime. And Haaland's definitely going to be a fixture in my team. He's probably going to be my captain for game week 2. As things stand, I would probably move the captaincy towards him. Salah's still probably a great option as well. I don't really see Crystal Palace stopping him from scoring, and at Anfield we know Liverpool are definitely a different beast. So if we wanted to play it safe, probably a Salah captaincy would make sense, but I think this is clearly an opportunity where you want to go for a Haaland captaincy, especially since he scored a brace versus West Ham. That added benefit of him being on penalties is a huge shout. Obviously, Mahrez being on the pitch could change things, but I do like that he started off with the penalties. That completely changes our valuation of him as an asset for the better. As far as Jesus, he presents a unique problem, right? Where if you are wanting to move towards Darwin and you want also Mitrovic in your team, it seems like Jesus is the one to make way. What I like about Jesus at his price point is you could ideally reflect that within a midfielder at 8.0, but because you're moving another asset within the 8.0 spot into Nunez, arguably, you need to find that 1 million in the bank somewhere else. And that probably means we're going to downsize our midfield. You know, there is a reflection within the community that you can definitely survive without the 8.0 midfielders, and someone like Foden playing today and starting it and still being not as involved as we imagine probably suggests that the 8.0s aren't as essential as we think. Kulusevski having a fantastic performance, but also we know he can have his highs and lows is something to think about. But I did like how interesting Kulusevski was. Potentially he becomes even more interesting as an asset going forwards and does call into question whether we need that 8.0 spot. But when we're talking about the Liverpool players, definitely I think moving into Darwin is very, very sensible. But it almost feels like we would be losing another Arsenal spot, right? We have the opportunity here to go for Arsenal attackers. There are going to be weeks where instead of beating Crystal Palace by 2-0, we might actually see this Arsenal team actually probably crumple some teams 5-0, 6-0, something like that, just like they did versus Sevilla. And I can see that being a possibility, and us missing out on 2 Arsenal attackers is going to be a big threat. What I do like about the season, as I mentioned, is potentially you could cover that by going for the Arsenal defense. But as someone who last season suffered quite a bit by not having an essential player like Saka, despite him being priced adequately this year, that does call into question how you want to structure your team. If we were to quickly just look at transfers in the future and me just trying to think about what my ideal team would be looking like now, I can definitely see myself going away from someone like Jesus and then going away from someone like Luis Diaz, moving into Darwin Nunez, but also trying to fit Mitrovic into the team, and that is as a replacement to Archer. So if I go for Mitrovic here, I am kind of stuck into a 4-3-3 template where I have to find a cheap midfielder, potentially to rotate alongside someone like a Bailey if I don't already have a replacement for him. Martinelli is also in the team. Potentially he could be Rodrigo in the future, but this template sort of precludes myself from going into another option. I might eventually find myself moving towards Perisic from Diaz, so that does save me a little bit of money. But it does feel weird if I, let's say, was going to go to Perisic, how I was supposed to play around this structure here and still find value options from a team like Arsenal. Potentially it actually does mean that I'm going towards a back 5. I could go for an Arsenal player here like Ben White. I just kind of like him a little bit more because he might be playing right back at times and potentially could even find himself towards getting an assist or getting bonus points through crosses in some easier games, because he did get matched with Zaha, who I imagine is one of the toughest tasks as a defender to have in the league. So his ability to really express himself in an attacking sense wasn't really there, because he probably was focused on the job, which was to try and stifle Zaha as much as possible. And under this structure, I'd still have 5.0 in the bank, but that does allow me the opportunity to go for someone like a callback. And hopefully with Pereira being such a threat, I still have a very, very flexible team here that I can play around with. This would be a 5-2-3 template, and perhaps money could even be squeezed from another option such as a Bailey to push myself into a 6.5 player or a 7.0 player instead of Martinelli. But as I said, this does present ourselves with a little bit of an 8.0 midfielder hole, and ultimately it might just be the case, as I said, that the 8.0 midfielders aren't actually worth the value that we have inherently placed on them from the start of the season, because so many people are priced there. But I think time will only tell, and it doesn't make sense to knee-jerk immediately to a 4-3-3 and disregard what the 8.0s have to offer. As I said, someone like Kulusevski was fantastic, so we have to think about that overall. So let's actually head on to the price rises and falls. So this week it seems like Zinchenko, at least tonight, and Haaland are going to actually push up towards a price rise, and that's going to be a huge sticking point for some Kane owners. I know a lot of people were already planning to go from Kane to Haaland game weeks 1, game weeks 2, just because there was the captaincy opportunity and the ability to pivot. But Haaland having such a great game versus West Ham has already pretty much threatened Kane owners to make this move tonight. And I can see a lot of the Haaland ownership being close to something like 80 to 85% effective ownership next week because of the knee jerking away from Kane. I do find it hard to see how some Kane managers might try to stick it out towards game weeks 3 to 5, where he does have a much better kind of short-term horizon, because the Haaland captaincy threat is so immediate. If you are the type of manager to kind of practice patience, I can understand not going for this move. I can also, at the same time, as I say, understand moving from Kane to Haaland. It would be very sensible if you plan on captaining him, because yes, it prevents you from going for a role. You're one transfer behind the Haaland owners, but if you believe in points, if you believe in Haaland and his ability to do well versus Bournemouth, it is a very sensible move to make. I don't really criticize anyone going for that move. As far as Zinchenko, I don't see why we need to knee-jerk into him. I think if you already have an Arsenal defender, he isn't exactly heads and shoulders above the rest. If you're someone who's opted to go for Gabriel, opted to go for White, opted to go for Ramsdale, there's no pressing threat to move into them. If you're someone who has 2 Arsenal players, then yes, it would make a lot of sense to go into Zinchenko. I do think he's a transfer to think about. But once again, think about who you're moving out. I think at the end of the day, a lot of us who've started off with players from Liverpool, from City, even Trippier, for example, who still has a great game week 2, you don't really have anything to fear about. If you are someone who did start with an Aston Villa defender, as an example, with someone like Dean or Matty Cash, definitely a Zinchenko transfer is something I'd like to think about. I can't really see Aston Villa being super high on people's estimations after losing to Bournemouth quite convincingly. And at the end of the day, their best fixtures are the short term. The fact that they lost comfortably to Bournemouth without producing anything is already probably a suggestion that they were the wrong picks to go for. I can understand why people are a little bit concerned over Bailey as an asset, but you don't have, I would say, an immediate threat like in the defensive positions where there are other more interesting 5.0 options. For example, Kieran Dewsbury-Hall, I don't really think he's going to be an asset that we expect to see holding every single week, whereas Zinchenko could be someone who is very, very close to getting a clean sheet every other week and could also see himself getting in defensive involvements. Now, I'm not expecting Zinchenko to get assists very, very frequently, but I can definitely see him finding himself with maybe 1 goal every, let's say, 15 games, or getting an assist every 5 games. And that's sort of the quality that Zinchenko looked like when he was playing for Arsenal versus Crystal Palace. It was a very, very tough matchup, I might add. There were certain elements in the game that did point towards Crystal Palace being super competent. Zaha was an incredible threat. Eze still looked as good as ever, especially recovering from his injury. And this Crystal Palace team is very, very well oiled. I mean, we've seen their defensive partnership. Anderson Guehi is definitely a top 5 centre-back pairing within the league, and the fact that this Arsenal team quite comfortably dispatched of them shows their temerity and their kind of composure, and I really like moving into Arsenal defence. Can't really complain about people moving into them unless the situation is ready that they already have Arsenal assets. As far as players like Mitrovic and Kulusevski, I do think Kulusevski is 100% a knee-jerk. I don't really see himself getting a price rise. He's not that close to it. Martinelli is definitely super well priced. He did miss a really poor chance for the Arsenal team early, but no reason not to go Martinelli if you don't already have triple Arsenal. As far as Mitrovic, as I said, I think he's going to break the template completely. He's too well priced. At 7, he seems like a steal. if you just go off the performance that he had versus Liverpool, and that's already backed up by a very, very successful season under the same manager, Marco Silva, in the Championship, and we know the quality that Mitrovic has, especially since he was able to display it versus Virgil van Dijk. As far as Kulusevski, as I said, it doesn't really seem like an option that you'd want to go for in the short term. He does hold an 8.0 midfield position, and he could be quite lethal. I don't expect him to get 1 goal, 1 assist every sort of performance. Knee-jerking into him doesn't really make sense before the Chelsea game. Definitely something to think about, especially if you were to move away from someone like Luis Diaz in the future. I mean, and wanted to stay within the 8.0 template, and maybe wanted to go for Mitrovic as opposed to Darwin, then 100% maybe have a think about Kulusevski then. But I wouldn't knee-jerk into him at this point in time. Saliba, I do think he makes sense as a 4.5 move. I think a lot of people are really gassed about how interesting he is as a player. He had a very, very astute performance and just provides with so much comfort if you're watching him play and you're an Arsenal fan. Can't really complain about him as an asset. I do think it's quite 50-50 between him and White when it comes down to FPL points, because I think both of them will get a lot of minutes over the season, and I don't necessarily see anyone displacing either White or Saliba when it comes to, let's say, Arteta and his starting 11. What you'll see from Arteta last season is whenever he found a winning streak within a certain team and a certain XI, he does like to stick with it until things go desperately wrong. And that's why I think there's a lot of value within Saliba and White. With White, you have a little bit more guarantee from last season, and Arteta potentially having faith in him. So that's kind of why I feel like White might just edge him for now. But as individual players, if you prefer watching Saliba play, if you think that he can be an aerial threat as well on top of that, which is something that Ben White doesn't necessarily possess, then Saliba is definitely a great option. All of the picks I don't think make too much sense. Ward is close to a price rise, as we can clearly see him probably becoming a Leicester goalkeeper. I imagine a lot of people who weren't going for the Leicester rotation opted to go for Ward as opposed to gambling for Iverson for the game week 1 start. But yeah, Ward is definitely a super interesting option, and I can definitely see him continue to rise even if Leicester have really tough games and don't really get themselves clean sheets. That's just simply what the opportunity of 4.0 keeper presents us if he's going to start consistently. If we go towards the price rises, because I don't think looking at page 2 is super helpful. Players like Pepe, Marquinhos, Smith Rowe, they're all dropping. I mean, nothing super interesting there. Not even sure if it's worth discussing. Kane is certainly very close to price rise in terms of players that I think people quite higher ownership over. Tomiyasu as well. I'm not exactly sure why Tomiyasu or Reguilon have ownership. It seems like perhaps this is mostly the casual fan, so I wouldn't really be particularly concerned if you're an avid FPL player. The same thing goes for Tierney. So when it comes down to it, really the only person affected by price changes recently are going to be someone like Alonso and Kane and Watkins as well. So I would say between those assets, Kane makes a lot of sense because he's the only way you can kind of go towards Haaland, and most people have sacrificed something within their team structure to make sure that they have one of the two, or at least the ability to flexibly move between them. So Kane moving down in price isn't something that I would expect to happen tonight or tomorrow, but Haaland moving up in price does seem like an 100% certainty when we go back to page 1 over here. And I would say, as someone who's looking at Haaland as a potential threatening player for game week 2, or if you actually just have more confidence in Haaland going forwards, then 100% make that move. I think when we think about moves, it's actually really helpful to move between premium players because their guarantee for points is a lot higher. So when you're actually wasting a transfer, in a sense, to move from Kane to Haaland, it's actually probably the transfer you'd like to make because you think that there's such an upside or variance between the points they're about to get, and potentially when you add the 200% in with the captaincy, that can completely change things for you. As far as exercising a little bit of patience at the start of the season, that's definitely something you want to think about if you're a Haaland owner. I can't imagine if you're a Haaland owner why you'd want to think about a transfer immediately unless you really feel like you can move into someone that you think is underpriced or undervalued, such as a Martinelli. But at this point in time, I think the template is still relatively similar. And by game week 3, I can see it moving to a 4-3-3 to accommodate for players like Mitro and Darwin. But for now, I would say probably hold your horses. Trust in the research that you did in the preseason. Don't try to chase price rises and falls unless you're moving into a team that you don't feel like you've covered, such as a City, such as an Arsenal. And that's pretty much all I have to say for this video. I hope you guys have a wonderful time, and I'll see you guys for the cheat sheet.